The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of Windsor Castle as Sergeant Major James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what he believed would be the last time. After 28 years of dedicated service to the Crown, today marked his final day as a member of the Queen's Guard. The weight of tradition pressed heavily on his shoulders, not just from the bearskin hat that crowned his head, but from the knowledge that generations of his family had stood in this very position. James had never imagined his military career would end this way. A recent diagnosis of a progressive joint condition meant that the long hours of standing perfectly still, which had once been second nature to him, now caused excruciating pain that shot through his legs like lightning bolts. His doctor had been clear, continuing in his role would only worsen his condition and could lead to permanent damage. The Army Medical Board had reluctantly agreed to his early retirement, but James felt as though he was abandoning his post, his regiment, and everything he held sacred. The castle grounds were unusually quiet for a Tuesday morning. Most of the royal family was away on official duties, and the typical crowds of tourists had been reduced to a small group of early visitors who moved respectfully around the perimeter. James took his position at the main entrance, his rifle held at precisely the correct angle, his face a mask of stoic professionalism that had taken years to perfect. As he stood there, memories flooded back to his first day on duty. He had been 22 years old, fresh from training, and terrified of making even the smallest mistake. His father, who had served in the same regiment 30 years earlier, had given him a simple piece of advice. "Remember, son, you're not just guarding buildings or people, you're guarding history itself." Those words had shaped every moment of James's career. The irony was not lost on him that his final day coincided with one of the quietest periods he could remember. There were no state ceremonies, no visiting dignitaries, no crowds of photographers capturing every movement. Just the steady rhythm of his breathing and the distant sound of groundskeepers tending to the castle's immaculate gardens. Around mid-morning, a black Range Rover pulled through the castle gates with the quiet authority that marked all royal vehicles. James maintained his position, eyes fixed straight ahead, but his peripheral vision caught the familiar sight of a royal protection officer stepping out first, followed by a woman he recognized as one of the senior royal nannies. Then, like a small whirlwind of energy barely contained by formal protocol, Prince George emerged from the vehicle. The young prince, now 10 years old, had grown considerably since James had last seen him up close. Gone was the chubby-cheeked little boy who used to hide behind his mother's dress during official events. In his place stood a confident young man with his father's determined stride and his great-grandmother's keen observational skills. George was dressed casually in dark jeans and a navy sweater, a far cry from the formal attire James was used to seeing him wear during public appearances. The prince's hair, slightly tousled from the car ride, caught the morning light as he walked with purpose toward the castle entrance where James stood guard. What happened next would be seared into James's memory forever. As Prince George approached, instead of walking past as protocol dictated, the young royal slowed his pace. His eyes, bright and intelligent, seemed to take in every detail of James's uniform, from the polished buttons on his tunic to the perfect placement of his medals. But it was what Prince George did next that caught James completely off guard. The prince stopped directly in front of him, just outside the prescribed distance that protocol demanded visitors maintain. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the two stood facing each other, the seasoned soldier on his final day of duty and the future king who would one day be the supreme head of the very forces James had served with such dedication. Prince George's expression was serious, thoughtful in a way that seemed far beyond his years. James, trained to maintain his composure under any circumstances, felt something shift inside him. There was a recognition in the young prince's eyes, an understanding that transcended the usual formalities of royal encounters. The nanny, clearly uncomfortable with the breach in protocol, took a step forward and gently called, "Your Royal Highness, we should—" But Prince George raised his hand slightly, a gesture that was both polite and unmistakably authoritative. The nanny stepped back, her training overriding her instincts to hurry the prince along. In that moment, James realized that Prince George was studying him with the same intensity that James had once used to memorize every protocol, every regulation, every tradition that governed his service. The prince seemed to understand that he was looking at more than just a guard in a colorful uniform. He was looking at a man whose life had been dedicated to service, whose family had contributed generations to the protection of the crown. The morning breeze rustled through the trees surrounding the castle, and James felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. Here, in his final hours of duty, he was being acknowledged not by a superior officer or a fellow soldier, but by the very person whose family he had spent his career protecting. It was a moment of connection that no military manual could have prepared him for. Prince George's protection officer maintained a respectful distance, his trained eye constantly scanning the surroundings while allowing this unusual interaction to unfold. Years of experience had taught him to recognize when the royals needed space for moments of genuine human connection, and this was clearly one of those times. As the minutes passed, James began to understand that this was not a casual encounter. Prince George had not stopped by accident or out of childish curiosity. There was something deliberate about his presence, something that suggested he knew exactly what this moment meant to the man standing before him in the red tunic and bearskin hat. The weight of James's rifle seemed to grow heavier in his hands, not from physical strain, but from emotional significance. This weapon, which he had carried with pride for nearly 3 decades, would soon be handed over to another soldier who would continue the unbroken chain of service that stretched back centuries. The thought both humbled and saddened him. Prince George remained perfectly still, his young face reflecting a maturity that spoke to the unique education he was receiving about duty, service, and the weight of responsibility that would one day rest on his shoulders. In that quiet courtyard, with only the distant sounds of castle life around them, a silent conversation was taking place between past and future, between service rendered and service yet to come. The silence stretched between them, but it was not uncomfortable. Prince George continued to stand before James with the same quiet dignity that had been instilled in him since birth. The young prince's eyes moved deliberately across the intricate details of James's uniform, taking in the regimental badges that told the story of battles fought and honors earned across distant lands and decades of service. James noticed that Prince George's gaze lingered particularly on the service medals pinned to his chest. Among them was the Afghanistan Service Medal, earned during 2 brutal deployments where James had served not as a ceremonial guard, but as a frontline soldier. The Jubilee medals marked significant milestones in royal service, while the Long Service and Good Conduct Medal spoke to years of unwavering dedication. Each piece of metal represented sacrifice, commitment, and moments of both terror and pride that had shaped James into the man he had become. What struck James most profoundly was the respect evident in Prince George's demeanor. This was not the casual interest of a child fascinated by colorful uniforms and shiny buttons. This was the focused attention of someone who understood, despite his young age, that he was in the presence of something significant. The prince seemed to grasp intuitively that the man before him represented far more than pageantry and tradition. The morning light shifted as clouds drifted across the sun, casting the courtyard in softer shadows. Prince George reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew something small. James's peripheral vision caught the movement, but his training kept his eyes fixed straight ahead. The prince held what appeared to be a simple white envelope, unmarked and pristine. For a moment, Uncertainty flickered across Prince George's face. Despite his royal upbringing and the confidence that came with it, he was still a 10-year-old boy grappling with emotions and situations that would challenge adults. The envelope trembled slightly in his hands, and James could sense the internal struggle taking place in the young prince's mind. Prince George's protection officer noticed the hesitation and took a half-step forward, ready to intervene if necessary. But something in the prince's posture, a subtle straightening of his shoulders and a firming of his jaw, signaled his resolve. This was a moment he needed to navigate alone, without the safety net of adult intervention. The nanny, who had been maintaining a respectful distance, glanced nervously at her watch. The prince's schedule was carefully planned, and this unscheduled stop was already creating ripples in the day's arrangements. But years of working with the royal family had taught her to recognize when flexibility was more important than punctuality. This was clearly one of those moments. Prince George stepped closer to James, moving within the traditional boundary that separated the public from the guards. It was a breach of protocol that would normally result in immediate intervention, but the circumstances were anything but normal. The young prince's movements were deliberate and respectful, showing that he understood the significance of crossing that invisible line. With careful precision, Prince George placed the envelope at James's feet, positioning it so that it would not interfere with the guard's stance or duties. The action was performed with a solemnity that seemed to acknowledge both the formality of the moment and its deeply personal nature. The envelope lay there like a bridge between two worlds, the public face of royal duty and the private recognition of individual sacrifice. James felt his throat tighten with emotion. In 28 years of service, he had received many commendations, medals, and formal recognitions. But this simple gesture from a 10-year-old prince carried a weight that surpassed them all. It was acknowledgement from the future king that his service had been seen, understood, and valued. The prince then did something that nearly broke James's composure entirely. Prince George stepped back to his original position and, with movements that spoke of careful instruction in royal protocol, performed a slow, precise bow. It was not the casual nod that royals typically offered to acknowledge their subjects. This was a formal bow of respect, the kind typically reserved for state occasions and encounters with foreign dignitaries. The gesture sent shock waves through the small group of royal staff present. The protection officer's hand instinctively moved toward his radio, unsure whether this breach of traditional hierarchy required reporting. The nanny's eyes widened with a mixture of concern and admiration. In her years of caring for royal children, she had never witnessed such a spontaneous display of respect from a member of the royal family toward a member of their staff. But Prince George seemed oblivious to the stir he was causing among the adults around him. His focus remained entirely on James, and in his young face was an expression of understanding that spoke to lessons learned not just from tutors and governesses, but from observing the examples set by his parents and grandparents. He had clearly internalized the concept that true leadership meant recognizing and honoring those who served. As Prince George straightened from his bow, James felt a single tear escape and roll down his cheek beneath his bearskin hat. The emotional control that had been his trademark throughout his military career was crumbling in the face of this unexpected recognition. Here was the future king, barely 10 years old, teaching him something about dignity and respect that no military manual had ever contained. The envelope at James's feet seemed to glow in the morning light, its white surface stark against the dark stones of the courtyard. James knew he could not break protocol to retrieve it while on duty, but its presence was like a warm ember of recognition that heated his entire being. Whatever the envelope contained, the act of giving it had already accomplished something profound. Prince George remained in position for several more minutes, his presence serving as a silent honor guard for the honor guard. The symmetry was not lost on James. Here they stood, the soldier who had dedicated his life to protecting the crown and the future king who would one day wear it, sharing a moment of mutual respect and understanding. The castle around them continued its daily rhythm. Gardeners tended flower beds. Staff moved purposefully between buildings, and the distant sound of London traffic provided a constant urban backdrop. But in their small corner of this historic place, time seemed suspended, allowing for a connection that transcended rank, age, and the formal structures that typically governed such encounters. When Prince George finally moved, it was with the same deliberate grace with which he had approached. He took one step backward, then another, maintaining eye contact with James until protocol demanded he turn away. The spell was broken gradually, gently, allowing both participants to return to their respective roles without the jarring shock of an abrupt transition. As the prince walked toward the castle entrance, his nanny and protection officer fell into step behind him. James could hear the quiet murmur of voices as the adults processed what they had just witnessed, but their words were lost in the greater significance of what had just occurred. The envelope remained at James's feet, a tangible reminder that the entire encounter had not been a figment of his imagination. Its presence would challenge his ability to maintain his stoic composure for the remainder of his shift, but it also filled him with a sense of completion that he had never expected to feel on his final day of duty. The hours that followed Prince George's visit passed in a blur of heightened awareness for James. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow more defined, as if the young prince's gesture had awakened senses that military training had taught him to suppress. The envelope at his feet had become both anchor and compass, grounding him in the moment while pointing toward an uncertain future beyond his military service. As the afternoon sun reached its peak, the changing of the guard ceremony approached. James had participated in this ritual thousands of times, but today it carried the weight of finality. His replacement, a young corporal named Davies with barely 2 years of service, would soon take his place. The symmetry was poignant. James was ending his career at Windsor Castle, the same place where he had taken his first ceremonial posting as a nervous 22-year-old. The sound of marching boots echoed across the courtyard as the relief guard approached. James recognized the measured cadence, the precise timing that spoke to countless hours of drill practice. The familiar rhythm triggered a flood of memories. Winter mornings when the cold bit through even the heaviest uniform, summer days when the heat made the bearskin hat feel like a furnace, and spring afternoons like this one when the duty felt more like privilege than obligation. Corporal Davies approached with textbook precision, his uniform immaculate, his bearing confident yet respectful. James could see something of his younger self in the man's eager professionalism. During the brief moment when their eyes met, James attempted to convey through his expression the wisdom that only decades of service could provide. That this duty was both burden and honor, that the stillness required was not emptiness, but fullness, that every day spent in service to the crown was a day spent as part of something greater than oneself. The formal exchange was completed with minimal words, as tradition dictated. "Post relieved," Davies announced quietly, and James responded with equal brevity, "Post relieved." But within those simple words lay the transfer of responsibility that had been passed down through generations of guardsmen, an unbroken chain of service that would continue long after James had returned to civilian life. As James stepped away from his position, he carefully retrieved the envelope that Prince George had left. Its weight surprised him. Whatever lay inside was more substantial than a simple note. His fingers traced the edges of the envelope, noting the quality of the paper and the absence of any royal seals or official markings. This was clearly a personal gesture, not an official communication. Walking toward the guardhouse where he would complete his final administrative duties, James was approached by Captain Henderson, his commanding officer, and a man who had become both mentor and friend over the years. Henderson's usually stern expression was softened by genuine emotion as he extended his hand. 28 years, Sergeant Major, Henderson said, his voice carrying the weight of shared experience. The regiment won't be the same without you. The handshake lingered, both men understanding that this moment marked the end of an era in ways that extended beyond James's individual service. Thank you, sir, James replied, his voice steady despite the emotions churning within him. It's been the honor of my life. The words were simple but heartfelt, carrying the accumulated gratitude of a career spent in service to something greater than personal ambition. Henderson's eyes fell to the envelope in James's hand. May I ask what that is? He inquired with the gentle curiosity of a superior officer who had learned to balance formal protocol with genuine human interest. James looked down at the envelope, then back at his commanding officer. Prince George left it for me, sir, during his visit this morning. The statement hung in the air between them, both men understanding the unprecedented nature of what had occurred. Henderson's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained professional. That's quite remarkable, Sergeant Major. Quite remarkable indeed. He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. Would you like to open it here? Or would you prefer some privacy? The offer of privacy was both considerate and wise. James appreciated the gesture, but found himself curious to share this moment with the officer who had guided his final years of service. Here would be fine, sir, if you don't mind. With careful fingers, James opened the envelope. Inside was a folded piece of heavy cardstock, clearly expensive and chosen with thought. As he unfolded it, his breath caught in his throat. The card bore the royal coat of arms at the top, but below it was handwriting that was unmistakably that of a 10-year-old child. Carefully formed letters that spoke to both good education and personal effort. The message was brief, but profound. Dear Sergeant Major Mitchell, thank you for keeping my family safe for so many years. My father told me about your service in Afghanistan and how brave you were. I wanted to tell you that I will remember you when I am king, and that I hope you are happy in your new life. Your friend, George. Below the message was a small drawing, clearly the work of a child's hand, but executed with care and attention to detail. It showed a figure in a red uniform standing guard outside Windsor Castle, with the Union Jack flying proudly overhead. The simple artistry captured something that no photograph could, the dignity and purpose inherent in the role James had fulfilled for nearly 3 decades. Captain Henderson, reading over James's shoulder, let out a low whistle of amazement. In 30 years of service, I've never seen anything like this, he murmured. The young prince clearly understands something about honor and service that many adults never grasp. James felt his composure finally beginning to crack. The combination of the prince's words, the innocent drawing, and the realization that his service had been truly seen and valued created an emotional response that years of military discipline could not contain. Tears flowed freely now, and he made no attempt to hide them. Sir, he said to Henderson, his voice thick with emotion, I need to write a response. This cannot go unanswered. Henderson nodded, understanding. Of course, Sergeant Major. Take all the time you need. Use my office if you'd like. As James made his way to the captain's office, he reflected on the remarkable chain of events that had transformed what he had expected to be a day of sad endings into something approaching celebration. Prince George's gesture had reminded him that military service was not just about following orders or maintaining traditions. It was about human connection, about the bonds formed between those who serve and those who are served. Sitting at Henderson's desk, James took out a piece of official regimental letterhead and began to write. His message was carefully considered, balancing the formality appropriate to addressing a member of the royal family with the genuine warmth inspired by the prince's kindness. Your Royal Highness, he wrote, Your words and drawing have given me the greatest gift possible as I end my military career. The knowledge that my service mattered to the people I was sworn to protect. I will treasure your message always, and I promise that the lessons I learned in the Army about duty, honor, and service will guide me in whatever comes next. I am proud to have been your friend, even for a brief moment. With deepest respect and gratitude, James Mitchell. As he sealed his response in an envelope, James realized that Prince George had accomplished something remarkable. Through a simple gesture of recognition and respect, the young prince had transformed a soldier's retirement from ending to beginning, from loss to legacy. The 10-year-old boy had demonstrated a wisdom about leadership that many adults never achieve, that true authority comes from acknowledging and honoring those who serve. Walking out of Windsor Castle for the final time as a serving soldier, James carried with him more than just memories and a pension. He carried the knowledge that his years of dedication had been witnessed, understood, and valued by the very person who would one day embody the crown he had protected. In the growing twilight, as he made his way toward whatever future awaited him, James Mitchell knew that he was leaving not as a man whose usefulness had ended, but as someone whose service had become part of the continuing story of duty, honor, and the subtle but profound gestures that bind a nation together. The young prince's bow, his drawing, and his heartfelt words had created something new from something ending, proving that respect given freely and genuinely has the power to transform both giver and receiver. In years to come, whenever James would tell this story to his grandchildren, he would remember not just the honor of serving his country, but the greater honor of being recognized by a future king who understood that true nobility lies in acknowledging the nobility in others.